Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Beneath the Surface. Today we'll be asking what is the political agenda of Christian Zionism. Joining us today on Beneath the Surface is the Anglican Parish of Christ Church. In addition to his parish ministry, he is an author and theologian. Thank you very much, StephenSizer, for joining us.
Thank you.
Can you tell us about the Holocaust and what took place at the time?
Well, the Holocaust was one of those dark, evil events in history. Began in the 1930s in Germany, when the German leadership under Hitler began to discriminate against and literally liquidate certain groups in society, in German society, that were deemed inferior or subhuman. Those who were deformed, those who had physical disabilities, and minorities such as the Gypsies, the Romani community. And then Hitler began to target the Jews, primarily because the Zionists had supported Britain in the First World War, which had led to the defeat of Germany. And so I think in the early days of the Second World War, some within the Nazi movement saw Palestine as a possible solution. You know, anti-Semitism just wants to get rid of the Jews, and to get rid of them to somewhere else was one of the possibilities. And some of the Zionist leaders attempted to convince the Nazis to allow them to do that. But progressively, within the Second World War, Hitler began to having identified the Jews around Europe as he expanded his empire into Europe, defeating France and Holland and Poland, the Czech Republic, and other countries, began to transfer Jews out of those countries into concentration camps, camps where they were concentrated. And he used them as slave labor in his armaments factories. And then progressively they were liquidated through gas ovens and other forms of mass extermination. As to the exact number of Jews who were murdered, we will probably never know, but it does amount to millions, along with Romanis, along with many other minorities, smaller minorities, Christian leaders, for example, who were a threat to the Nazi empire. So the Holocaust has left a legacy in the minds of Jewish people around the world that led them to believe that their only hope was in founding a state led by Jews and for Jews. And again, in the early days, in the late 19th, early 20th century, a number of solutions were offered, including in South America, in Africa, and other countries. Solutions were offered. But ironically, the strongest group advocating for a Jewish state was within the Christian church, the Zionist Christians. And they believed that the Bible mandated the return of the Jews to their ancient homeland in the Middle East, the land of Palestine, Canaan. And so the Zionist leaders at the beginning of the 20th century began to focus their efforts on creating colonies in what was then Palestine. And in the First World War, they convinced the British that they could assist the British in their war effort by bringing America into the war if Britain underwrote the founding of a Jewish state in Palestine. At the time, Britain controlled much of the Middle East, and therefore Britain was seen as the benefactor. But as Britain declined in influence as a result of the two world wars, and America took over that role, the Zionists switched their alignment to America as the one that would help solidify and perpetuate the Zionist experiment in Palestine.
So did the Christian Zionists support Hitler in a way that they'll be able to get, the Jews would be able to have their own state?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that there were anti-Semitic people in the United States and in Europe. There were anti-Semitic people in many European countries that wanted to get rid of the Jews. In Poland and in Russia and even in Britain. We had the black shirts, who were the Nazis in Germany, but we had brown shirts, who were the fascists in Britain. There was a fascist movement in Italy, in France, who sided with Hitler and were sympathetic to seeing the Jews they were jealous of their influence, their wealth, wanted to get rid of them. What we can say is that in the United States, some within the Christian community looked at world events in the 1930s and 1940s in the same way they do now and said, how can we understand these events in the light of the Bible? And frankly, you can find anything in the Bible if you look hard enough. And where God warned his people they would suffer if they rebelled, we find other passages where God promised blessing if they obeyed. Well, if the Jews were suffering in Germany, some Christians shrugged their shoulders and said, well, this is the Bible coming true. And so they acquiesced at the suffering rather than saying, it may be as a result of sin or rebellion, but suffering is wrong. We must do something about it. And so, sadly, in the big picture, the war effort, defeating Germany was more important than saving Jews or saving minorities who were caught up in the war.
Why were the Jews targeted? Because you did mention they were jealous of their wealth and their influence, but if they were that influential and that wealthy, wouldn't have they been able to remove that target or fight back in a way?
Well, some within the Jewish community who had the foresight and had wealth did get out. In the 1930s, there was an emigration of Jews from Germany to America, to Britain. If you had wealth, then you could travel, you could get out. So it was largely the working class, the poorer, and the middle classes who suffered during the pogroms and through the persecution and the Shoah, if you like. And there was some resistance. There are instances of Jews who fought back, who resisted the Nazis and went underground and cooperated with the Allies in seeking to defeat Germany. But the reason I believe the Jews were targeted by Hitler was partly, as I said, because the Zionists supported Britain against Germany in the First World War. But sadly, again, we go back to our prejudices and our suspicions of people who are different. I'm sure you can empathize with other Muslims in Britain who are stereotyped because of either your clothing or color or traditions. And in the same way, Jews who kept to themselves, who kept to their traditions, who wore their distinctive clothing, for example, were easy to spot. They were easy to be the scapegoats for civil unrest and frustration with the suffering within Germany during the times of the Depression. You know, the 1930s, there was starvation, there was mass unemployment, and it led to the rise of fascism. And sadly, some within the Jewish community who were doing well, maybe they were owned companies, they were factory owners, they were wealthy landowners or industrialists, they were targeted. In the same way that in Russia, during the revolution, it was the aristocrats, the wealthy, who were targeted then.
How come the Holocaust, even though it is very tragic and what took place isn't just at all, but how come education, especially in the West, it focuses on the Holocaust, and then when, of course, the Jews were to go to Palestine, it ends there and the education system doesn't continue speaking about what actually took place in Palestine later on?
Well, the emphasis on the Holocaust within education or within our culture today is, again, largely the result of the way the Zionists have made sure that their story and their script is heard. That's not necessarily their fault, but if others have not done as successful a job in pointing out that there have been other massacres, other holocausts, other injustices such as the Palestinians, then it's our responsibility. The destruction of the Armenians by the Turks at the beginning of the 20th century was an equivalent Holocaust. Millions of Armenians were murdered by the Turks to suppress the rights of the Armenian community. In the same way, the Kurds are denied their freedoms and their independence. It's ironic that Turkey refuses to work with the Kurds in Turkey, the KKK. They refuse to work with the Kurds in Syria, but they will work with the Kurds in Iraq because the Kurds in Iraq have oil and the Turks want the oil. So, money talks. So there have been many other Holocausts, the destruction of the North American Indians, the Incas, the indigenous blacks in Africa by the colonial powers in Europe, for example, the slave trade. These are other examples of man's inhumanity to man. But why the present injustices in Israel-Palestine are not necessarily reported or covered in school curriculums, perhaps in the way that the Holocaust is our responsibility to make sure that they are, and that our young people are better informed of the world in the Middle East today.
So people who are pro-Palestine should kind of speak to the national curriculum in order for the situation in Palestine to be taught.
Yes, I'm going to give you one example. The centenary of the Balfour Declaration is 2017. The Balfour Declaration was published in 1917. Well, at the moment, a group in Britain called the Balfour Project has brought together academics and activists from all walks of life, Muslim, Christian, secular, with the aim of ensuring that our national curriculums in England, in schools, cover the Balfour Declaration and the broken promises Britain made to the Arabs and to the Jews when Britain was controlling Palestine. It's a golden opportunity in the next 3 years to make sure that we learn the lessons of history and don't repeat them.
That'll be amazing if it's taught. However, don't you think history is kind of repeating itself in a way?
Well, history tends to be the record of the victors. The victors tend to write history. And that's why it's very important that we invest in good historical narratives for Palestinian children to learn about their own culture and not allow Israel to dictate what history is taught in Palestinian schools. Yes, we could never invest too much in the education of our young people because they are the leaders of tomorrow.
That's why we need to mention all the historical events that took place, and it's also kind of focusing on the Jews as well, because the way they were treated during the Holocaust was disgusting. But then, in a way, with all my respect to the Jews, and especially the ones that didn't hurt the others, but it kind of did repeat itself in a way. Of course, not to the extent that Hitler did it, but it is also tragic.
Yes, there is a clear parallel in psychological terms where children who are abused are more likely to commit abuse when they grow up than if they had not experienced abuse as children. The behaviour, the way in which we're brought up, influences the way that we act as adults. And I think that's true of nations too, that the suffering of the Jewish people in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, has led to a resilience and a determination to create a state for themselves at the expense of the Palestinians. And so the Palestinians, in a sense, are suffering the consequence of Hitler's attempt to destroy the Jewish people.
But it's really sad that's actually taking place in Palestine. Palestine beforehand, it was known to be for more than one religion and for more than one culture. The Jews were there, the Christians and the Muslims. It wasn't just a Muslim country. So
that's why our faith is very important, because we believe in the possibility of redemption, the possibility of transformation. We are not predetermined. We are not. We don't have to be fatalists. We can change our behaviour, our lifestyle, our beliefs, and God wants to bring good out of evil. And so the experiment of Israel-Palestine, if you like, is a golden opportunity for Jews, Muslims and Christians to show the world that we can learn from history and that we don't have to repeat history, and that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was never intended to be a justification for retaliation, but it was intended to be a limitation on justice, that it was meant to be proportionate. But sadly, our world is led by those who advocate disproportionate retaliation as the means of getting their own back on their enemies.
With the situation in Palestine, as you mentioned, the Bible said that the Jews would be returning to their ancient homeland. However, they, like many Jews, have actually said that they shouldn't actually have a land. They shouldn't actually have a state. That's when they believe when the Messiah is to come, that's when they'll be able to have the land. How come this is still taking place where the Israelis are still taking more and more land as they possibly can?
Well, we live in a world where people find their security in their identity, in their nationality, in their locality, in their possessions, and it's natural. If your parents owned a house and they give it to you, you feel a sense of obligation to care for it. It was entrusted to you, and you want to bequeath it to your children. So it's good that we take responsibility for that which is entrusted to us, whether it's in our family or by God for our world today. And again, I think there's nothing wrong in feeling secure or good about our nationality or our identity. It doesn't mean I have to think that Britain is the greatest country in the world, but I can be enthusiastic when we win a football match, or when we do something good for the world. It's natural. Where it goes wrong is where my rights impede on the rights of others. So I wouldn't necessarily advocate that the Jews don't have a right to a land or a country. I would simply say that if you are born somewhere, that should give you certain rights and responsibilities. So whether we advocate two states, Israel, Palestine, or one state, really the Palestinians and Israelis have got to work it out for themselves, but as equals, not as the oppressor and the oppressed. But in terms of nationality, I think that the reality is that you are born Syrian, you are born a Lebanese, you are born a Jordanian. It doesn't mean to the exclusion of your world citizenship, doesn't mean to the exclusion of your identity as a Muslim or as a Christian or a Jew. Those should be more important. And so that's what I would major on. If I'd been born in Israel or in Palestine, I think that I would feel passionate about that, and my roots would be there. And we've got to help those people work out a future that does not deprive those same rights from others who were born there.
Do you think that when examining the one-state solution and the two-state solution, many people and many political analysts have stated that both of them don't benefit Israel in any way, shape or form, hence they are not going to be taking either one. They're not going to be, one state as the Jewish state that they dreamed to have would, fail straight away. And if they were to be a two-state, that means, they wouldn't be able to get all the land that they hope to have. So do you think that when we speak of the one-state or the two-state solution, that they're actually solutions, that they're actually going to take place?
They're not actual solutions, I agree, but in the short term, they're temporary measures that might lead to a solution. The two-state, one-state is a little bit push-pull. If you push against the two-state, then I'm pushing for the one-state. It's got to be one or the other. But I see the two states as a temporary solution to ultimately finding a more long-term solution. The tragedy is that the leaders of Israel today, the Zionist lobby, do not want to give up the settlements, but they do not want to share the land with the Palestinians. And so they would rather keep a perpetual state of war and ambiguity, and under that cloak, under that darkness, if you like, take more land, because they can get away with it, because they can. And that's why we've got to make it impossible for them to continue in that greedy, selfish, self-centered approach to diplomacy. If America stopped funding Israel and stopped backing Israel and actually cooperated with the rest of the world in imposing sanctions on Israel, Israel would settle quite quickly, because it would know that time is running out, and if it doesn't settle, it will lose more than it will gain. At the moment, it has no incentive to stop.
Do you think the Christian Zionists are supporting or are contributing to the Holocaust, as some people say, in the Middle East?
The Nakba. Yes, I believe they are, because they are giving support to the Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. They are sympathetic to the attempt to rebuild the Jewish temple. They're lobbying for Jerusalem to be the exclusive capital of the Jewish state. These are ways in which Christian Zionists are supporting Israel and in so doing galvanizing the Zionists, strengthening the Zionists in their exclusive racist approach to the Palestinians. So yes, sadly, many Christians, whether intentionally or otherwise, are either acquiescing or are promoting the perpetuation of the Nakba.
Why do they want Jerusalem to be the capital state of Israel?
Again, it goes back to the Bible. You know, in the Bible, Jerusalem was the capital of the Jewish state. And the Zionists want Jerusalem because they know that a Palestinian state is not viable if you don't include East Jerusalem. It's the densest area of Palestinians, I think, short of Ramallah. The old city is central to Islam as well as Christianity. And if there are more Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem now than there are Palestinians, they've already taken over most of East Jerusalem, so they're nearly there in terms of the two-state solution being completely dead.
But then why does Israel want to remove the Aqsa Mosque and create a temple instead? Like, the Aqsa Mosque is very historical, other than it having a lot of significance to the Muslim people. Why do they plan to build a temple when there's so much more land where they can build it in another place?
Well, the Jewish temple, which was built by Solomon, King Solomon, was built over the place where they believe Abraham sacrificed Isaac. Muslims believe that Abraham sacrificed Ishmael. Well, the place, Jews believe, is under the Dome of the Rock. Inside the Dome of the Rock, there is a little rock that protrudes from the floor, which was the highest point on Mount Moriah. It was the hill around which Jerusalem was built. And so they believe that the temple was built over that place, and that was where they believe Almighty God came down to earth, his Shekinah glory. As he led them out of slavery in Egypt, he brought them to Jerusalem. So it's very, very special to Jews as the place of atonement, the place where their sins could be forgiven, where they could be made right with God. When the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, after the time of Christ, by the Romans, within Orthodox Judaism, there was no means by which they could experience God's forgiveness, because there was no possibility of a sacrifice. And so within Orthodox Judaism, certainly within Zionist religious tradition, the temple is paramount, but it has to be built in the same place as the original temple. The problem is, Jerusalem is a completely different city today to the one that existed in 2,000 years ago. And so Jewish archaeologists can't agree as to where the old temple was. There are 4 different locations where the temple might have been, 3 of which are on the Haram al-Sharif, and the 4th is further down in the city of David in Silwan. So there is a disagreement, but the most likely contender is somewhere between the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And in strategic terms, I envisage the Zionists will seek to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, will seek to partition it, use it as a synagogue until such time as they can destroy the Dome of the Rock and rebuild a Jewish temple. And then they believe that it will be possible for them to make atonement for their sins and to be made right with God.
But won't they be able to still, pray and ask for forgiveness in that location without building a temple?
Yes, I believe so, but I'm not Jewish, and therefore it would be presumptuous of me to tell them what they can or cannot do. But I believe that a solution has to be found that will respect the 3 faith traditions, Christianity, Judaism and Islam, without starting World War III. And I believe that is what will happen if the Jews destroy the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Because, as I'm sure you would understand, the Haram al-Sharif and the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the 3rd most holy shrine within Islam, and Muslims all over the world will not tolerate its destruction, I'm sure.
Of course, and it's not just that, but when we look at the situation, there are many videos and footage that show Jewish people praying around the area, not in the mosque itself, but around it. And to see it being destructed isn't really nice, because that's kind of like a place where Jews and Muslims come together to pray. And
yes.
So
yes, I mean the Western Wall is where Jews have traditionally prayed. And until relatively recently, the Orthodox Jewish rabbis forbade Jews from going onto the Haram al-Sharif out of fear that they might step on the Holy of Holies. They might step on sacred ground. But the more radical settler rabbis who are increasingly shaping Zionism in Israel are now advocating the actual taking by force of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and leading the way, as we know, with these weekly demonstrations and attacks on Muslim worshippers.
But then with these rabbis, the ones that are saying that are telling the Jews not to go because they may be stepping on holy land, won't they be able to influence the others as well and have a louder voice, in the sense that if they were to destruct it and build something else, they may be removing that holiness that they, believe in?
Well, what we've seen over the last 100 years is a progressive shift within Judaism toward militant Zionism. Orthodox Judaism, Jews around the world pray to God at different times of the day, wherever they are living, and as Muslims do, and Christians too. But the Zionist movement, which was originally secular and was opposed by Orthodox Jews, has shifted as the settler program has expanded and the settler movement has grown. They now constitute a significant element within the Zionist movement. They are radical, they are militant, and they are intolerant of other faiths. They are driving the Zionist agenda in Jerusalem, and in particular in the Haram al-Sharif. And when rabbis advocate settlers going onto the Haram al-Sharif to pray and disrupt Muslims from their acts of worship, that I believe is heresy, or is anathema to the Jewish tradition as much as the Christian tradition.
Of course, but like every religion, there's always a certain point where people would like to go in memory of God. Like in the Muslim faith, you have Mecca, and you have the Holy Prophet's mosque as well, and of course Al-Aqsa. So to have something physical, even though of course wherever you pray, God would accept it, but to have a location, it makes it more special in a way. So I understand where the Jews are coming from. But then you also said that there are other 4 locations in which
the temple might have been built.
Yeah, might. So can't they build it in those other places, or is that going to cause trouble in a way?
I think that the Haram al-Sharif, although it's quite a large platform, you know, when you stand on there, it's a very large platform. I think that it will be very volatile to advocate sharing the Haram al-Sharif with a Jewish temple alongside the Muslim shrines. I don't know whether that would be acceptable. If the Waqf, if the religious authorities within the Muslim tradition in Jerusalem agree to share the Haram al-Sharif, then it might be possible. But it can't be done unilaterally or imposed militarily, as we're seeing happening today.
But you're saying that it can't be, but it is happening today, as you
I'm
just
saying
said.
it is happening militarily today.
But then they're not really going by the religious authorities to get the location. And it's continuing, even though many people are raising their voices on, especially on social media, saying hands off Al-Aqsa, but it's still actually taking place.
It is taking place, but I think the momentum is growing that will reach a point where there is either a violent reaction, or, God willing, a non-violent reaction that will make Israel's actions intolerable, either through trade, through sanctions, through boycotts, through civil disobedience. I believe that this is the way to lower the temperature, if you like, take the heat out of the tension. But if you are determined to do something, then you will find a way to do it. And there have been a number of attempts to destroy the Dome of the Rock, or the Haram al-Sharif, on the Haram al-Sharif, on various occasions in the past, armed attacks, assaults by individuals or by groups. And we must be vigilant to ensure that it is free of those attacks, free for people to use for worship.
In one of your books, you have a heading stating the future opposing peace. Do you think that the Christian and Jewish Zionists are against peace?
If you spoke to them, they would obviously deny that. They would say, of course, we're for peace. But I think they spell peace, P-I-E-C-E. They want a piece of the land. And they do believe that peace will come when the Messiah comes, but they tend to believe that there will be a war before Jesus returns, a war, an apocalyptic war between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and that they like to believe they're on the side of the good and God will punish the evil. So if you believe that there is going to be a war, then it's not hard to find oneself actually
creating one or starting one off.
Creating one. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are determined that God's vision of the future is a peaceful one, where the nations are reconciled, then that gives you the determination to bring it about, to work for that. But sadly, because many of our Zionist friends believe there is going to be an Armageddon, and that then we'll be raptured, rescued, and taken away by God, then they say, in a sense, bring it on. Let's get on with it, because then Jesus will come back.
But doesn't that make them the evil person for starting off the war?
Yes, and I regret that deeply, because it's not consistent with the scriptures. There's an occasion in the Gospels where 2 of the apostles, they've been thrown out of a village because the people didn't want to hear Jesus. And they said to Jesus, "Shall we call down fire from heaven?" Just like the prophet Elijah did. And Jesus rebuked them. He rebuked them because he did not want to destroy these villages just because they didn't want to hear him. His message was one of peace and reconciliation, and not conflict and judgment.
So what is the political agenda of Christian Zionists?
Well, in summary, their agenda is clear. They are lobbying on behalf of Israel because they believe the Jews are God's chosen people. They are encouraging the Jews to return to the land, make Aliyah. They're funding that program because they believe the land was given to the Jewish people exclusively. They are campaigning for Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel and moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, and because they believe this will solidify Israel's control of Palestine and Jerusalem. It'll solidify their control of Jerusalem. So they're campaigning for that. Some Christian Zionists are funding the Temple Mount Faithful and other political organizations determined to destroy the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the Jewish temple. And they are there is an antipathy toward Islam, an antagonism toward Muslims within Christian Zionism because they believe that God is on their side against their enemies. So their theology is driving a political agenda that's exclusive, racist, that is confrontational and is deeply destructive.
So in the eyes of the Christian Zionists, Muslims are the evil, are the bad people, basically?
Well, I don't like designating people as bad people. I believe that we are all sinners, and I believe that Christian Zionists have been deluded by Satan. They have been deceived. They are misguided. And through my writings, through my books, and through the presentations I make, I seek to illuminate their minds, to resolve their ignorance, to undermine their prejudices, and help them to understand that God has called us to a ministry of reconciliation, that He wants us to treat everyone equally, that He cares particularly for the vulnerable and the marginalized, the refugees, and therefore our hearts should go out not just to the Jews who've suffered in history, but to the Palestinians who are suffering today.
That is what is actually meant to happen, of course, as the majority of, if not all religions, actually do believe in peace and taking care of the vulnerable and the marginalized. However, have you actually come across Christian Zionists and spoken to them and tried to change their mindset in a way and give them the actual Christian Bible context?
Yes, because Christians do believe the Bible is God's word, when you show them from God's word what He actually says about our responsibility, we do see people change their minds. Through my books, through the video With God on Our Side, through the video The Stones Cry Out, for example. These are being shown in churches around the world, particularly in America, and they're helping to educate Christians into our responsibility not to be one-sided, not to side with Zionism. And so we are seeing a shift. It's slow, we have to be patient, but we have to be resilient and determined not to give up, even in the face of attacks, criticism, accusations of anti-Semitism and so on, which come our way regularly.
That's really sad you're seen as anti-Semitic, because what you're actually stating is the truth. And thanks a lot for your books, because they have given us a lot of insight on actually what has been taking place, and not just, it's also given us the perspective of the Christian Zionists and what they actually are determined to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us on the show, and thank you very much for watching Beneath the Surface. See you next time.